Thanks very much for coming to Goldsmiths and welcome. My name is Nick Taylor. I'm a research fellow in the Political Economy Research Centre, as well as on the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity here at Goldsmiths. And it's a real pleasure to be hosting our three prestigious guests here today. I first went to Mariana and Michael's book launch, the Political Quarterly book launch, and thought that it was exactly the kind of thing that we're also focusing on, and had an idea to put people who are invested in sustainable and inclusive growth together in a room with someone who's invested in post-growth and see what happens. And the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, or CUSP, is a 5-year project, and it is aiming to explore the moral, social, political, and economic dimensions of prosperity on a finite planet. And my colleagues Will Davies and Richard Douglas here at Goldsmiths are also working on this. I'm just going to say a very brief word of introduction for our chair today, who's just been exercising out on New Cross Road. And then I'm going to hand over to him for the rest of the event. We are filming today, just to let you know. And after the event, you will be able to get Rethinking Capitalism outside in the cafe. And Michael and Mariana, I'm sure, will be willing to sign a copy for you.
At a discount.
At a discount as well.
20% discount. Very, very good value.
Okay. Yes. So, without further ado, let me introduce Tim. Tim is the Professor of Sustainable Development at the University of Surrey and also the Director of CUSP. He was the Economics Commissioner on the Sustainable Development Commission in the UK between 2004 and 2011, I believe. Yep. And this work culminated in the publication of his book, Prosperity Without Growth, which just recently came out in a second edition this year with Routledge. He was also awarded the Hillary Laureate for Exceptional International Leadership at the end of last year, which is a very prestigious prize. As well as this, Tim is an award-winning dramatist. So maybe we'll get some performance today. And I'm going to hand over to Tim, who will introduce the speakers. We're going to have a joint lecture from them and then a bit of discussion with our three guests, and then we'll hand over to Q&A and discussion from the audience. So without further ado, Tim.
Apologies first for being late. As Nick said, I direct the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, which is funded by the ESRC. And the ESRC, in their wisdom, called me into a funders meeting earlier this afternoon. And it's just one of those things, it's not such a good idea to turn down. But also it is a good idea to plan exactly how long it's going to take to get you from a funding meeting to the intellectual content, and I'm afraid I didn't quite manage that. But I'm here now, and it's a huge pleasure, because a part of the premise of CUSP, of course, is that we need to think slightly differently about prosperity. And one of the reasons we need to think a little bit differently about prosperity is because the existing model of how to achieve prosperity has some flaws in it. Those flaws have been evident actually for some time in the question of the impact of a growth-based economy on a finite planet, and in particular in relation to problems like climate change and the massive loss of biodiversity and the planetary boundaries that we're pushing up against. And those shortcomings also became more evident, of course, through the financial crisis now 7-8 years ago, which prompted a kind of existential angst amongst economists, most typified, I think, by the story that Michael and Mariana recite at the beginning of the book about the Queen's visit to LSE and asking a naive question about why didn't anyone see it coming. And the assembled group of economists ummed and ahed a little bit, and then they went away and did what academic economists do best, which is to have a few seminars and to think a little bit about the research question. And then they came back with an answer which was something along the lines of, it was, Your Majesty, at the end of the day, collective failure of imagination of some very bright people, which was a little bit disingenuous given structurally what's built into capitalism. And that's really where the work that Michael and Mariana have been doing picks up. It picks up off those structural elements of an existing system and our academic knowledge about those elements, and explores how and where we might need to rethink capitalism. And there's really no better two people really to have done that together, to have brought that expertise together than Michael Jacobs, who I've known for a long time, actually, longer probably than either of us care to particularly reflect upon. But he and I were hanging around in the days when he published what was then an absolutely iconic book and remains the foundations of thinking about the green economy. So the green economy, I think, was published in 1991 or something. Michael went on then to be an advisor to Gordon Brown in Treasury. He was also led the Fabian Society for some time, General Secretary of the Fabian Society, it's called, and he is now director of the IPPR Commission on Economic Justice, which I understand is just kicking off. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about that later on, and a visiting professor at University College. University College is also the home of Mariana Mazzucato. She's Professor of Economics of Innovation and Public Value there, and she's in the process of establishing a new institute on innovation and public purpose. Mariana's the author of one of the most insightful books about the nature of capitalism and how it works, and in particular the role of the public sector in that, The Entrepreneurial State. Amongst many other things, Entrepreneurial State rightly won a few prizes of its own, and it's based on some lovely, lovely anecdotes. Amongst them is that most of the technology that goes into the Apple iPhone was funded by US public sector research budgets. What she didn't say in the book, but remains equally true, is that the US public research budgets also funded the technology which allowed me to introduce her talk today about, and I think there's an infinite loop there somewhere. I won't go there. The point is that boundary between the public sector and the private sector, and those axioms about the market knowing best and government perhaps crowding out innovation when it intervenes in the market, are patently shown not to be the case by the kind of work that Mariana has been doing. But the book is a wonderful collection of essays, and to present it to you now, I'm going to hand straight over to Michael to show us a few slides. Michael.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you all very much for coming. So this is a kind of joint lecture. So I do the first half, in which I try and talk a little bit through some of the problems that we think both capitalism and economics are facing, and how they're addressed in the book. And then Mariana goes through some of our reconstruction of economic ideas in the second half. So that's how it's going to work. This is the book, available from all good bookshops, or indeed out in the cafe afterwards. We start, as Tim says, from this famous visit of the Queen to the LSE in 2008, just as the financial crash was gathering pace. And the reason we start there is because it's a very useful moment to kind of crystallise the joint problems of capitalism and economics. The question she asked, which was why so few economists had spotted the financial crash coming, pointed to two huge failures. One was, at that moment in November 2008, we were very close to capitalism in its financial form collapsing. I was in the Treasury at that point, and had Western governments, including the UK Treasury under Gordon Brown, not recapitalised the banks with vast sums of public money, many of which are still in there, the credit system would have collapsed, and you would have gone to an ATM, a cash machine, and found no cash in it. And for many businesses, that's exactly what happened. the cash system dried up. And this happened, as we know, across the Western economy and then affected the global economy. And capitalism came under really serious threat to its fundamental workings. But the other problem was that so few economists had spotted it. And for those economists who don't work in the financial system or in macroeconomics, that's a legitimate. They weren't looking at it, but even the economists who were not. And more importantly, the regulatory agencies, the Fed in the U.S., the Bank of England here, had not understood what was going on in the system. And this was, in a sense, symptomatic of the failure of mainstream economic ideas and mainstream economists, in our view, to understand the nature of the capitalist system that we now live in. And that was a catastrophic failure. But in fact, if you look, as we do in the book, in the introduction to the book that Mariana and I have written, capitalism is currently, in the present period, going through multiple failures. And the multiple failures of capitalism are matched by the multiple failures of economics to properly understand that system and therefore to provide good policy prescription and advice which might give us better management tools for handling it. So that's, in a sense, the core thesis of the book. I want to take you through some of the evidence behind the claim of multiple failure. When we published the book last summer, it was just after Brexit, the Brexit vote, before the Trump vote. One of the interesting things that's now happened is that more and more people, and not just the commentariat or the economists, have kind of accepted a thesis that capitalism has real problems. And it's been really striking how those two votes have kind of crystallized an understanding of some of the failures of modern capitalism. And in a sense, the public got there before most of the commentariat. Now, the Trump and Brexit phenomena are complex, and we shouldn't try and reduce them to simple explanations. Many different kinds of people voted for both of those things, but there is something, I think, in the analysis here which helps to explain them. So the first of the multiple failures of capitalism is financial instability and the associated weak growth that has followed it. So this is a picture taken from the Reinhardt and Rogoff book, This Time is Different, about the frequency of bank crises around the world, in which you can see, as you can see, the percentage of countries experience some kind of banking crisis. There is this extraordinary change that occurs just at the moment that liberalisation of the banking system begins to be instituted from the mid-70s and then particularly from the mid-1980s. Some of this is to do with banking as emerging economies get bigger and bigger financial sectors. Some of this is to do with the number of countries that there are for whom this would apply. But there has been a very stark increase in the number and the scale of financial of banking and financial crises. The system we now have is much more unstable than it used to be. Underlying this, so the important thing is to say we had a big financial crisis. We know massive drop of output. The growth rate since the financial crisis has been much slower. It's been a much slower recovery than in any of the previous crises that we've had. And the underlying phenomenon here is this, which is a rather remarkable fall in the share of GDP which goes into investment in more or less all developed economies. So investment is the driver of growth. It's the driver of higher living standards, measured conventionally. Investment has been on long-term decline. And this goes back here 20 years. And one of the phenomena that we really do need to understand if we want to understand modern capitalism is why is investment in decline? What is going on that a system which is still generating profits is the rate of investment is in decline? And Mariana, I think, will talk a little bit about this. So first of our major problems is we have a problem of a more unstable system, and we have a system in which the core driver of growth in investment is in decline. The second problem is what impact that has had on living standards and inequality. And this is really a rather important phenomenon. In principle, and in conventional economic analysis, you would expect wages and productivity to shadow one another, because wages in the end have to be paid. Wages are paid in return for productivity in the economy, and you would expect these to match. And before about the year 2000, before the mid-1990s, these did, by and large, go together. So productivity and wages more or less track one another. Since then, there's been a very notable divergence. And the other way of thinking about this is the share of national income in developed countries as a whole going to capital and going to labour. And the share going to labour has been in significant decline. So the distribution of the rewards of growth have become very significantly divergent for different parts of the economy. This is an illustration of that. These are quintiles of income, and this is the after-tax income growth over quite a long period here. This is quite a long period. You may wonder why there are 6 columns if these are quintiles. It's because this one is not a quintile. This is a percentile. So this is the top 1% of the income distribution in the US, and their income growth over this period relative to all the others. This is an extraordinary, not completely historically unprecedented. There have been other periods where something like this has gone on, but very significant shift in the way incomes are being distributed in the US economy. And this is basically a description of the same thing, which is this is the top 1% income and income change, and this is the bottom 99%. So there's been a very significant shift in the way incomes are distributed. This is the US economy, but we have a not exactly the same, but similar UK version of this, which is in the same period, before taxes and benefits are taken into account. Where has income growth gone, national income growth gone? And you can see it's gone almost entirely to the top half of the income distribution. So people in the bottom half of the income distribution have barely shared in the growth that we've had at all, and it's been very regressive in its impact. And if you want to understand slightly too simplistically the Brexit Trump phenomenon, these give you a good basis to do so. When people in deindustrialised areas, the so-called left behind, would say during both of those campaigns, the system isn't working. They may not have had the statistics, but they may have experienced the phenomenon that is illustrated here. This is a phenomenon of stagnant real wages, or relatively stagnant real wages, which is common to most developed economies. The UK is, however, an outlier. And recent work by both the Resolution Foundation and the Institute for Fiscal Studies shows that this line continues out to 2020 in the projections of income to make the longest period of stagnant or declining median wage growth that we have had since the 19th century. But there's also something else which is going on here, which is the other phenomenon, which I haven't got the chart for, is employment rates. Employment rate in the UK is much higher than most of these other countries. So we have a higher proportion of the population in work. We have a higher gender proportion. More women are in work, more people in general, and we have much lower wages. And that is a trade-off that the British economy has particularly made, which is that we have a very high employment but low wage economy. So capitalism doesn't operate in exactly the same way in all countries, but there are some commonalities. So the first two problems that we identify of the multiple problems of capitalism: financially unstable systems generating very weak growth, low and stagnant wages, and rising inequality. And there's a whole bunch of other graphs and so on inequality. The third set is the set around the environment and the environmental implications of growth. This is carbon. You may be familiar, those of you who know anything about climate change will be familiar with this. So this is greenhouse gases. The grey part of is our current trend of greenhouse gases, the brown part where we've already got to. The blue is where we need to be in order to try and hold global average surface temperature rise to around 2 degrees. Less than 2 degrees, which is the demand that came out of the Paris conference in 2015, is obviously even less, and it tends to zero. And what the Paris conference agreed was that we would have to get actually greenhouse gases to zero, carbon to zero, not long after 2050, greenhouse gases as a whole a bit later. For an economic system which was built on carbon, in which 80% of the world's energy supply is still fossil fuel based on carbon, this is an extraordinary challenge to make, and it is at its absolute heart an economic challenge to the model of capitalism we have now, because capitalism has been so carbon based. Many economists, including myself, would argue capitalism can survive this kind of transformation. It has to undergo tremendous change in the structures of not just energy production and use, but nevertheless this is quite a challenge. But it isn't the only one. And what we are, carbon and climate change have dominated environmental debate now for 15, 20 years. But as many environmentalists of various kinds have been pointing out, we are reaching environmental constraints of amongst a whole range of phenomena. This is work from the Stockholm Resilience Centre, identifying some of the different constraints and where we are relative to tipping points or critical factors. You cannot understand capitalism now without understanding the throughput of materials and energy, the impacts that has. So this is a very serious set of challenges for capitalism. What we do in the book is to argue that the problem is not just in these structural features of capitalism that are generating very poor outcomes now, in which capitalism, even in its own terms, does not appear to be generating the promise that it held of higher living standards, of stable growth for populations, but that the economic analysis, which dominates economic commentary and policy making, has not given us the tools to understand these phenomena well, which is partly why the policies that we've been using to try and tackle them have not worked very well. And each of the chapters in the book, written by a bunch of very well-known economists from around the world, tackles a different aspect of this phenomenon. So Stephanie Kelton, who was Bernie Sanders' economic advisor during his presidential campaign, picks up the issues of fiscal policy and austerity and shows why austerity was the wrong policy to try and address the crisis of demand which occurred after the financial crisis. And she draws on Keynesian economics, and Keynesian economics is one of the underpinnings of some of the work here. Randall Wray and Yeva Nassisian go further into monetary policy and challenge the conventional argument about what money is and whether money is an exogenous variable in the economy that is controlled by central banks or is an endogenous variable that emerges out of investment and demand conditions, and have a very interesting chapter on that, and come to, unsurprisingly, a different set of conclusions about the way we should have been running monetary policy. We need to remember that the last 8 years have been an extraordinary experiment in macroeconomic policy, in which we've combined fiscal austerity with the most loose kind of monetary policy we could possibly have had. Huge sums of money pumped into the economy through unconventional so-called quantitative easing and more or less zero interest rates. And they still haven't generated sustained growth, which is very difficult to explain in conventional terms. So we've been living through an extraordinary period, and the case being made here is that we need to understand the way the system works differently. Several of the chapters address the question of investment. Andrew Haldane, who is the chief economist of the Bank of England, looks at short-termism in capital markets, shows that there clearly has been an increase in the short-term nature of capital holdings, and proposes various measures to deal with it. Bill Lazonic looks at the theory of the firm, very basic theory in economics, and argues that we just do not understand the way firms operate through that conventional model of representative agents in a market system. Mariana's chapter looks at innovation, picks up some of the work that she's going to talk about in a second, also Tim has referred to, on how the innovation occurs. Innovation occurs in ecosystems of innovation which have both public and private actors in them. And we have a model-based chapter from Stephanie Griffith-Jones and Giovanni Cozzi looking at the European crisis, the recession in Europe, and what an investment-led strategy that was deliberately focused on trying to push investment in the economy would do. Shows up interesting results about the much better outcomes, not just for employment and growth that you would expect, but also for debt reduction. And this is where the paradox of austerity has been so damaging. Austerity designed to try and reduce debt has actually left debt very high, because it didn't generate growth. And so debt has not been cut. And if you look particularly in the periphery of Europe, where we've got particular, where the crisis has hit most hard, you have economies that have been put into penury, Greece in particular, without actually affecting its debt significantly at all. Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate, looks at inequality, takes apart the argument that inequality is the price of growth, and shows, now there's quite a lot of evidence on this, why inequality is bad for growth, as well as clearly being bad bad for those people at the bottom end of the income distribution. Colin Crouch looks at privatization, which has been one of the main policy instruments of the classical neoliberal consensus, and how that's generated extremely perverse results, both economic and political. And we've got two chapters which look at the environmental elements of this. Dimitris Engelis looking at why conventional environmental economics just cannot get to grips with the centrality of carbon within an economic system. You need a much more a much clearer analysis of path dependence in innovation. And Carlota Perez, concluding the book, has a very interesting long-run analysis of technological change and the relationship between technologies, social systems, the state, and the way and capitalism, and concludes with a kind of hopeful message that it is possible to imagine new technologies, both IT-based technologies, information-based technologies, and environmental ones, leading us to a new paradigm in which we are sustainable and we have a greater equality. So there's a set of essays here which do two things. They look at the problems which capitalism now has, and they look at the economics of how we understand them, and they conclude that conventional economic analysis has not helped us to understand them very well, but there are very good economic ideas and policy prescriptions which can do so. And the attempt of the book, the goal of the book, is to try and bring those arguments together into a coherent whole and argue that we need to do things differently. And Mariana will talk a little bit more about that.
What do you press?
Just the left click on the mouse.
Okay, so thanks. Michael did the hard bit, which was to actually go through the problem. And what I want to do is, I guess, do a combined thing, which is to give you a bit of insight into what is in the main sort of investment side, because we really do take this notion that, this whole secular stagnation talk that somehow, the bad times are coming out are actually due to key problems around investment on both the public and the private side. Austerity, which was just mentioned, that's sort of a crisis of public investment, but also financialization, which I'll talk to in a minute. So I want to sort of focus on what sort of comes out here, but also, more importantly, I think, to talk about why frameworks matter. That this notion that, there's all these problems that Michael mentioned. If you just go in and tackle each problem individually, you sort of repeat the big problem, which is that there's no systemic notion of what is it actually that we want to create, and how can we think of policy actually as co-creating, co-shaping the economy, as opposed to just fixing things when things screw up. And the financial crisis was, of course, a massive screw up, but if you just think of it as a problem that then you go fix, whether it's through financial market reform or, why is this not moving? Have I done something wrong? Oh. Right. That then we don't, we just basically, inch our way along and actually, in some ways, feed the problem. Anyway, so the big problem, I think, in terms of the policy framework is this crisis that we continue to have, which I would argue we've had since the 1970s, which is this kind of lack of understanding of what the state, and when I say the state, don't think of the state, kind of big brother, top down, but literally all the different public institutions that are taxpayer funded actually do in the economy. And literally think of it from the BBC to the Department of Education, the Department of Health, but also all the actual agencies within those departments. What has their role actually been in history, and especially, though, what can their role be today if, and this is a big if, we actually want to address, the 21st century grand challenges, and also, more importantly, this kind of three-dimensional objective that everyone seems to have, in the sense that everyone talks about it, which is to achieve smart, inclusive, and sustainable growth. Right? You go to the European Commission website, it's all over the website, United Nations, OECD, Obama's website before it was taken down, had those three words all over the place, because actually what those three words do, and they're very exciting words, and of course Tim's work is very much highlighting all that, which is what kind of growth we want, is that it's a really strong admission that what we should be talking about is not the rate of growth, but its direction, right? So smart, inclusive, sustainable growth is about directionality. And so what does it mean to take decisions, to actually have deliberation, strategy, and consciousness in public policy? Can we actually have it? Can we actually achieve this big objective if we just think about it in terms of this traditional way? And what is this traditional way that we continue to teach in our micro and macro 101 courses, but also that is completely out there in the vocabulary of policymakers, but also like business leaders when they talk to policymakers and journalists, and even unfortunately civil society talks about this, in terms of what we need policy to do is level the playing field, right? Make things, kind of raise it all to the ground so then, real competition can happen. Or again, come in and fix different types of market failures. Or de-risk things, right? So there's these difficulties out there, we'll take away those difficulties, de-risk the private sector. So there's this whole vocabulary that's used, and words matter, discourse matters. I used to make fun of all this postmodern stuff, but now I'm slowly starting to appreciate it. Words matter in the sense of, I've also learned all sorts of things recently in this new book I'm writing, which is this fantastic word, performativity. I'm sure most of you know it, but being an economist and kind of a narrow-minded one, I'd never heard of it. So how we talk about things and also affects how we measure those things, which then affects what people do, and then that feeds back into how we talk and theorize about it, right? So this whole vicious, potentially also virtuous cycle, depending actually how we're talking. Anyway, so the problem with this framework, let me just skip to the framework, which is just putting patches in different places, whether it's the public good patch, not enough investment in science, which is the public good, go fund some basic science. No one really argues about this. Some countries like my own in Italy, we don't do it enough, but no one really comes out and says the state shouldn't be funding basic science. You might have a coordination failure, which is the classic sort of Keynesian point, right? That you have too much investment in the boom, too little in the bust, so you should have the reverse. By the state. And actually Keynes, as I'll argue in a minute, said much more than this, but the modern day Keynesians have interpreted Keynes as fixing a problem, which is sort of the business cycle problem. Or you might have another big problem, which is sort of the finance problem. So these cute little SMEs, which I often like to bash because most SMEs are crap, and it's not clear why we always go save them. Some SMEs are worth saving, but no one says go save the teachers, all the teachers, right? But we know teachers are really valuable, but we don't say give them finance. Anyway, there's this fuzzy category of SMEs that we love to talk about, and they don't get enough finance, apparently. Actually, not true. We get a lot of finance, but anyway, this notion that you have an asymmetric information problem because banks actually don't know the quality of these companies because they're young, they don't have equity, and so they don't have that finance, so we need to come in and help those SMEs. Anyway, you could go all through, imperfect competition clearly needs antitrust policy. The classic pollution problem is a negative externality. Carbon tax, again, Band-Aid. So it's not that these market failures don't exist. They do exist. And again, we've just lived through one of the biggest ones ever. But seeing this problem as just fixing the failures as opposed to actually asking what kind of economy could we be building and how do we actively shape and create it through the interactions of different types of actors. Public, different types of public, private, all sorts of different types of private. And again, not just the cute little SMEs. Third sector, but also civil society. Lots of really interesting things have happened and continue to happen because of civil society movements or also trade union movements, right? We have weekends because of trade. People fought and died to give us weekends and have an 8-hour workday. That's part of that market shaping process. So we really make quite a bit of use in the introduction of the work of Polanyi and Keynes, but also Minsky. And I actually make use of these guys all the time, so I probably sound very repetitive. You're probably like, oh, she's talking about what she usually talks about. But these guys are really, really important. And why they're important is because, especially, I'd say Polanyi, if you read his book, is he completely dismantles this notion that you have a market out there and you intervene. Now, some people will say intervention is good. Some people say intervention is bad. But this notion that you have this intervention and this thing called the market, he's like, really? The national market, which is the capitalist market, which is quite recent, meaning 300 years old, there's nothing universal about it, was actually forced into existence through public policy. That's his main point in the Great, many great points in the Great Transformation, but it's a key point as far as this discussion goes. Keynes himself talked about, and this is why I say he's quite misunderstood, the real need to think big, to not just tinker on the edges, to really be doing what's not being done, and not to just think of what's not being done as just, a lack of private investment. But, the ability to really kind of dream in that kind of Kennedy moonshot way. A lot of that kind of talk is already found in Keynes. And if you bring these guys together, you really have a very different notion of what it is that we could be doing to address many of these problems that Michael talked about. And Hirschman, who's one of my heroes, said, well, you can't just talk about all these new ideas. Are you actually providing new categories? Are you providing a new framework? So I want to quite quickly go through, I think, 4 big and different types of questions, which kind of address these in that chapter 6, but also we address some of these in the introduction, which I think is just a very different way to look at the problem. The first is, kind of getting over this hang-up that people have of, oh, yes, we're going to, be active in the economy, but of course we're not going to pick winners. We're not going to actually make choices about what kind of sectors, what kind of technologies, what kind of economy. We're just going to, again, level the playing field and de-risk the market so that the private sector, as well as the third sector, which is increasingly active, can do their thing. And so, if you look at history, almost everything that has been interesting in the last 200 years was in fact chosen. And the big question should be, well, what does that mean? Does this mean top-down planning? Or does it mean to have some sort of vision or what I'll call a mission? And then within that, really enable in all sorts of different ways, bottom-up exploration, experimentation. This is the big challenge. We don't have an answer for it, but it's definitely to sort of get over this hang-up that we shouldn't be directing or thinking about directions. Second is, whether we're talking about public or private, these are organizations, well, people as well, but people work in organizations. What does that actually mean if public policy is actually going to take risks and think interestingly around the climate problem, think interestingly around innovation? What does it mean for the kind of risk that they're actually themselves going to have to take? Do we have the ability in the population in different countries to welcome that kind of risk through taxpayer money, right? And also what kind of risks actually have been taken, but even more so, how can we start believing in public institutions and actually enable them to become learning institutions that are told to explore and experiment and learn through trial and error? Is that allowed? Are public entities allowed to learn when as soon as they screw up, bang, they're blamed, right? Whereas in the private sector, we often say we should, of course, welcome failure, be entrepreneurial. How do we assess policies that are about shaping and creating markets and not just fixing them? Because there's no point in having ambitious policies, for example, that which I think the BBC has had historically, going way beyond just fixing the public good. What's the public good in broadcasting? It's, the kind of boring stuff. Very high quality news, which of course we all like. Great documentaries about giraffes in Africa, which of course we all like. But, the kind of soap operas and talk shows that they've also done, that's way beyond what they're supposed to be doing. So there's this whole charter review that happened last year, and if you look at the metrics and how the BBC was assessed, it was very much based on the fact that they should have just been fixing this little public good problem, and actually they were being too ambitious. So bang, step back. And they were told not to make any more fuzzy kids programs, I think. They somehow won their right to keep doing soap operas. Anyway, public banks are constantly being told that they're crowding out private banks. And again, if you look at the analysis of crowding out, it's very much coming from a particular justification of public intervention. So if we want to have an alternative justification, which is more market making, market shaping, what does that actually mean for the assessment? And lastly, if we actually want not just smart, not just sustainable growth in the green sense, but also inclusive growth, which is again on the tip of everyone's tongue, what does that mean? Is this just about redistribution, through taxes, as important as that is, right? So Piketty's whole thing about taxing wealth, very important, and the failure to do so? Or is it also about having a new notion of where that wealth came from in the first place, not just taxing it? And, actually, in the introduction, we talk about Keynes's notion of socialization of investment, which is very interesting because he basically says, and this is a bit of Keynes, which again, I think is very under-theorized, he says it's not just the public funds that we need to stimulate the economy, but also the actual form and structure of those funds, for example, through mutual companies, through public banks, or he was actually very interested in community banks. What do we actually know about the structural form of this public investment and how that itself can help both stabilize the economy, but also point it into more interesting directions. And so different types of finance. And of course, this isn't just public finance. So in some ways I could stop, but I still have 8 minutes, wow, okay. So I'll go through some of these quite quickly. So in terms, this is my usual little theatrical thing, which is, well, if you don't believe it, none of this would have happened. So, all these big technological changes, in fact, if we think about the whole directionality the innovation, all these different big changes, which aren't necessarily good, by the way. Take out any sort of normative flavor of what I'm saying. It's just kind of a fact. These big changes occurred, not just from, garage chinkers and great entrepreneurs and innovators, who of course were always important, but also massive amount of public funds, which also were very much thinking and actually having a vision around these changes, even before the private sector got involved. By the way, fracking, which as we know is creating problems, not just post-fracking in terms of after it occurred and all this, potential geological problems they talk about, but also, I can't remember how I was going to phrase that sentence, but anyway, fracking itself and shale gas were discovered through massive amounts of DOE financing, Department of Energy financing. So this should just warn you that this is not to say, oh, isn't this good? The state did all this, but in some ways, once we admit that the state has been absolutely important through its different institutions, right? This is kind of a decentralized network of different public actors, being quite important for actually getting this stuff out there. We better be careful. There should be a bit more of a debate, perhaps, in what's happening with this funding, who's deciding. Again, the fracking thing is quite an obvious example, but of course also around nuclear, even around green. Green itself has all sorts of different directions it could be taking within it. Andy Sterling's work at SPRU, or used to be until last week, just moved to UCL, his work is absolutely fundamental to show that precisely because public financing in all these areas is so important, we better understand how within these areas, why are things going that way instead of that way? Because we don't give the state much attention, we think that it's just there to fix these background conditions, we don't then monitor in some ways what's happening because we think, oh, well, that's just the market. These are firms who sort of come in and do things. Well, no. Anyway, so quickly, all sorts of different types of public actors have actually been very important across the whole innovation chain, not just the public good, basic research, basic science part. We all know that the research has always been funded, but lots of stuff even down here. So most of the patient, long-term, committed finance, and this is something that both Haldane and Lazonic pick up on in terms of the need for that kind of patient, long-term finance, not short-term finance, has often around the world been provided by different types of state actors. So in Israel, YOSMA, Public Venture Capital Fund, very important. In the US, SBIR. In the US also, the CIA has one of the biggest public venture capital funds. That should scare you. But anyway, so this is a network of different types of public actors. Also, of course, all that, the feedback effects. This is not a linear chain. So in Germany, the Fraunhofer Institutes very much try to nurture that. Here, we've tried to copy them with the catapults, just forgot to spend money on them. We think we spend literally 10 times less than Germany does. That iPhone example is interesting mainly because of how many different organizations, but also because, ooh, wow, Army, Navy, Marines, defense, is this really just the Cold War? And the answer is no. It's not just the Cold War in the sense it was for this kind of technology, but what's very interesting is how this kind of mission-oriented financing, and by mission, I'll show you in a minute some of the mission statements of these organizations, but that was very much replicated in both the Department of Energy and Health, and also today in Europe, very much. Some of the biggest pots of money are happening around health and life sciences and around energy. So ARPA-E, the sister organization of DARPA, which came out with the internet, in the US at least, very, very important player around new forms of energy, including battery storage. I think they've come out with the biggest innovation. But again, in health, what's interesting is if you look at the funding, it's actually been quite stable and also kind of apolitical. So even under Reagan, right, there was an increase in financing. Now, this isn't necessarily, again, good, right? Because even within health, what is being financed? And could it be, and I do actually think this, that the shape of the market, the contours of it, in some ways hasn't been disrupted enough by some of this financing, that what you should be doing, if you're an active, kind of mission-oriented public actor, rethinking the space and having a real discussion with both civil society, the third sector, and an open discussion basically with all the actors, perhaps also redefining that market as opposed to simply financing a lot of drugs, right? So something like 75% of new molecular entities are actually financed by public institutions across the world, but also perhaps redefining that market around also lifestyle. There's very little research around lifestyle. There's even very little research on really boring things like diagnostics and surgical treatments, which is interesting because I didn't know that. But this kind of pharmaceuticalization, this is John Abrams' word, of health in some ways is a lack of imagination by the public sector when it is, in fact, fixing this massive market failure. But in fact, again, it's been very much shaping that area. Carlota Perez, in her chapter, she talks about the need to not just think about the supply side of financing, for example, in the Green Revolution, but recognizing that in almost all the revolutions that I had in that previous graph, these general purpose technologies, demand side policies were just as important. So she says, in the chapter, she says that in fact mass production would not have been fully diffused and fully deployed without a very ambitious policy around suburbanization. Again, forget whether it's good or bad. I mean, I grew up in a suburb. I don't think they're that great. But again, I'm not an architect, even though now I'm in the Bartlett School, which I guess I will learn a bit about this. But suburbanization very much came out of public policy and allowed mass production to get fully deployed and fully diffused. So not only are the technologies often heavily financed through different types of public actors, but without that demand side bold policies, they don't get diffused. So she argues that green shouldn't just be thought about in terms of renewable energy investments, which we need, of course, but it could even become a new direction for the ICT revolution, which hasn't been fully deployed and fully diffused. In fact, there's all these people like Robert Gordon who have fun showing you the indoor toilet and the internet, and they say, which one would you get rid of if you had to just choose one, pee outside or do your email. So that's kind of a joke to say the IT revolution actually hasn't had as much effect as, say, electricity and all sorts of things. And that's not really true. The IT revolution hasn't been fully diffused and deployed, in partly because we lack the imagination of how to allow it to have the effect that it could, which is not just a technological problem. In green, I'm actually not going to go through all those 4 questions. I'll stop in 2 minutes. In green, we see the exact same thing, that it's not just a lack of funding problem. It's that some of the highest risk areas continue to be underfinanced. There's plenty of finance out there, but what is being financed is sometimes sort of the easier stuff, and what we need is pretty bold and ambitious, different types of finance willing to invest in those difficult areas. And there's 2 chapters actually that deal a lot with these public banks and the lack of understanding we have around them. So just in the green energy landscape, and there's great databases from Bloomberg on this, you really see that some public actors like public banks have been playing an absolutely crucial role, investing more than almost any of the other actors. For example, Germany's public bank, which is playing not only a classic counter-cyclical role, right, during the crisis, increasing disbursements as opposed to what the private banks did, but also directing that finance very much around their energy ban policy. And the energy ban policy, by the way, in Germany is extremely exciting because of what Carlota talks about. It's not just about renewable energy. And some of those investments, of course, have gone bad, as investments do. It's been very much also a demand-side policy, also in Norway and much of Scandinavia. And it's also forced lots of different sectors to innovate. So steel in Germany, they've really decreased their material content through repurpose, reuse, and recycle, as opposed to steel in this country, which is quite inertial and then has to get bought up by Tata Steel to do anything. Anyway, these counter-cyclical and ambitious sort of mission-oriented public banks are very hard to understand if you just see it as a fixing problem. And in fact, they're often then accused of crowding out, of taking up too much space. What are you doing? Why are you directing finance in this way? Why not just sort of fund all the small companies, small, medium companies that need finance? You cannot, as a state, make that choice to move things in a particular direction. We need more thinking, if you want, of how to understand them. The most active public bank in the world today is the Chinese one. And if you look at these numbers for these particular companies, some of which have gone bust, they might scare you until we admit that Elon Musk in the U.S. through SolarCity, Tesla, and SpaceX has received very similar amounts of money through different types of public funding in the U.S. And one of the really interesting questions, I think, for China, which is today leading very much in both telecoms and in green, is coming back to this issue of structure, the structure of finance. Does it matter? This is one massive bank. It really is kind of top down, whereas in the U.S. it has been this kind of decentralized network of different types of public actors. Does that matter? And we know it matters through the systems of innovation literature. Again, Chris Freeman, who founded SPRU, when he compared Japan and the Soviet Union. It was all about looking at the systems that had been in place in Japan, which allowed them to grow more than the Soviet Union, which had been spending more on innovation but didn't have those kind of dynamic interlinkages across the economy. And I think this is something that people will start watching. It's not just the investment versus consumption problem. Anyway, I don't have time to do any of this, so let me just go towards the end, which is, because I've actually addressed most of this when I was talking about it, which is the whole inclusive growth issue. And, how do we actually then structure these investments, literally the contracts? Think of it not just as a new deal, but a deal, right? Even patents, they're not rights. I don't know who ever thought of the word IPR, intellectual property rights. You have no rights, it's a contract, let's negotiate it. And patents themselves could be negotiated, as we used to, quite strongly. Governments had top lawyers. I have a friend here who's a QC. He used to help the UK government actually negotiate different contracts. He said today it's just these little farts out of law school paid very little, because the government itself has very little money and little, remit to actually be negotiating very strongly around things like patents. And so what we see with patents is they've been increasingly going upstream. Patents used to be downstream. In other words, the tools for research themselves are being patented. That's a deal problem. It's not whether patents are good or bad. We're closing down the research itself. Prices of drugs, which are out there, being talked about as a big problem, that's a deal problem, right? When publicly financed research became patentable, if you look at the actual acts around that, in the US it was called the Bayh-Dole Act, it actually says the government should have the right to cap the prices of drugs that were publicly financed. It's in the act, it's actually legal, and they've never done it. They've never exercised that right. And in terms of this investment problem that Michael talked about, today we have record level hoarding, so 2 trillion euros in Europe being hoarded, $3 trillion worth just being used for things like share buybacks, right, to boost your stock price, stock options, and executive pay. That's an investment problem, but that itself is a deal problem. One of the most innovative private companies in the world was AT&T with Bell Labs, which was very important for the IT revolution. Bell Labs came out of a deal with government, because monopolies, which are not rights, no one has the right to a monopoly. It's a government-granted contract. At the time, when Bell Labs was being set up, it basically came out of a provocation from government to AT&T saying, you can only keep your monopoly status if you reinvest your profits back into the real economy, back into innovation, and big innovation beyond telecoms. And so that sort of, give and take, I think, is very much part of this kind of market shaping and market creating need, not just framework, but need. We have to shape these markets through better contracts. And that's why, and I'm very curious to hear what Tim will say, for me, really, the problem is not about growth or not growth, or markets or state. It's very much how do we interact to actually shape these areas in particular ways, which has to do both with this kind of mission-oriented notion of what do we want to create, a greener, more inclusive, more sustainable, smarter kind of economy, but also what are the relationships between the organizations in both public, private, and third sector that are required to get the right balance. Anyway, so in several of the chapters we actually tackle this in different ways, but I'll stop now to allow Tim to react, yeah?
Thank you very much. I'm a little bit of a disadvantage because I didn't know until Nick told me that the reason that I'm in the room is because he wanted this fight. If he told me that, I might actually have said no because I seem to be a little bit outnumbered. Or am I? I suppose that's one of my questions to you. You've pitched this book in a very particular way. I mean, if you could start with Marx, accumulate, that's the Moses and the prophets, and you could lead through a process of rational argument to an understanding that capitalism itself leads to the accumulation of assets, the stagnation of real wages by workers, and the destruction of the environment, because you're accumulating economic value, you're accumulating material value, that's having an impact on the planet. You're paying workers as efficiently as you can, which means less and less and less as time goes by, and as you clearly showed. And that means there's less purchase power in the economy, which means that ultimately you're heading towards stagnation in growth rates. And so the internal and the external contradictions of capitalism could lead you to a position where you actually say, capitalism, stuff it. But you didn't. You took a position, and it's a really interesting position, which said basically that it's possible to rethink capitalism. Of course it is. I mean, there's lots of things you can think about, but you made a slightly stronger argument, which is that there are two things going wrong. One was in capitalism, one was in our understanding of capitalism, and if we fixed our understanding of capitalism, we could make capitalism work. I just wanted to push you a little bit on that assumption, because some of what we understand about capitalism would seem to be suggesting that it's actually a very difficult thing to be making work, particularly in the context of finite planetary boundaries, the internal mechanisms of wages and profits, and so on and so forth. I think we have a lot of common ground, particularly when it comes to talking about the need for investment and indeed the relationship between the public and the private sector. But Nick definitively wanted me to say something that might tee up a little bit of a fight, and that's my attempt to do it. I do. I remember you saying that.
We had a good fight.
Yeah, it's good. Okay. And I remember you said it was just such an offhand comment about all these people who talk about no growth, and I'm not sure if we knew at that time that you were sat next to one of them, but it was an entertaining moment. So just to kick off with that little bit of challenge.
Can I have a... So actually there are two different versions of this, I think. So one is it possible in a capitalist system defined as a system of private enterprise, private circulation of capital, with the state clearly very involved, as Mariana has said, in which profit drives activity and so on. So I think we need to be a bit careful about how we characterise this. But to achieve more sustainable, inclusive goals, or does it naturally tend towards uninclusivity, unsustainability, and therefore would you have to just change the structure of ownership, which was the kind of original Marxist view, or some other deep change money, as some people have said, or whatever. So so there's another one, which is can you politically do it? So is this or is the political project of trying to manage capitalism in the kind of way, and my personal view of this is that there are very, very deep challenges. In answer to the first question, there are very, very deep environmental challenges. So I think we are running up against all kinds of environmental constraints. Now, it is definitely theoretically possible to continue a system which generates growth, because growth is a growth of value. It's harder and harder to do so. It requires immense technological change, immense imaginative change in the way we structure our societies and so on. And I think there are real challenges to that. Can you manage a capitalist system to generate more inclusive outcomes, more sustainable outcomes, more inclusive outcomes? I think the answer to that is yes, in that I don't think there aren't single systems of capitalism. States are very important, as Mariana has pointed out. So public policy, the impact of the democratically run system over the way in which capitalism is structured is... So we should not think of capitalism as a kind of natural system with interventions. It is created out of social structures which can be changed. Firms are not the same in every country. Labour markets are not the same in every sector. The role of the state is different. These are socially malleable structures, and therefore it seems to me that you've almost got a semantic problem, which is we can definitely shape the structure of our economic system differently. It has been different in lots of different places in different historical periods. Whether once you've changed it radically you still want to call it capitalism or not is a semantic question. But the process of doing so is much more like the reform of the system than it is the overthrow of the system, because there's a gradual change problem. And so I kind of see that as there is a separate question, which is, do we have the political agency to do that? It seems to me incontrovertible that you could shape this system in different ways. I think the political agency we have to do it, where you have massive accumulation of power attached to capital, I think is a different question. I personally think it's possible. It's not looking very good at the moment.
Right.
Let's say something quickly. So what I find striking is, if you read Marx, and I actually did, I had to read Marx, Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, 3 times. one's in Spanish. Anyway, and there's no theory really of the state beyond it being a manifestation of the bourgeoisie's sort of power. So, and it's actually, I mean, the serious analysis is in Marx in terms of why the system potentially will fail, right? I mean, in terms of capital-labor ratios, et cetera. And so, and the fact that in some ways, he was kind of right, actually, on the falling rate of profit. I don't know if you've seen the very interesting new research on that. But in terms of what can be done, if there's no theory, actually, not just of the state, of the notion of public value, right? If we're talking about value, right, which is any notion of prices and profits and things, in the end, for economists at least, is about value. There's no notion of public value, let alone of public policy, in the Marxist analysis, which is the one, at the heart of sort of what your question is this system just inevitably going to create inequality? That's a problem in the framework. And so I think what Michael's been talking about is, there's varieties of capitalism. By the way, the varieties of capitalism literature completely failed to understand America, right? It was like neoliberal capitalism in America versus, say, Scandinavia, ignoring the fact that the state was massively involved, not so much in the welfare state, but in the innovation state, so in competitiveness in America. So all this stuff I was talking about before. But, there is this thing that, there's stakeholder, shareholder kind of capitalism. There's different ways to shape the system. So have we actually experimented enough to have an answer to your question? I think the answer is no, because we haven't properly admitted that we could play around with the system literally as Play-Doh, but, Play-Doh makes it sound like we're all going to be happy. Actually, it's a war. It's, it's warfare. Currently, there's actually a war, I would say, on the public, but very much a war on, can we use the word working class, right? I mean, if you look at the profit-wage ratio, it's at record level. This is one problem, by the way, with Piketty's analysis. It was very much on the rate of growth versus the rate of capital. The real issue is profits to wages, did you show it? It's at the highest, and that's about, let's call it class warfare, right? Which, don't think of it just as a negative thing. Again, this is about, what can you do about that? You can strengthen unions, you can strengthen bargaining power, you can change unions so they're not always defensive, but actually a bit more offensive in terms of, again, acting and working alongside business and the public actors of, what kind of innovation do we want? And this whole debate about, are the robots going to take our jobs? It's like, no. Poor robots are just sitting there just, kind of waiting to be programmed. David Ricardo, already in 1821, he was asking that question because mechanization was completely taking away labor, jobs and reducing wages already then. So chapter 31 of his great book on political economy, what actually has changed since then is not mechanization and its effect on labor. It's always taken away the labor share. What's changed is this whole financialization problem, that when profits generated from any sort of innovation are not reinvested back into the economy, that renewal, where one sector dies and all those workers are laid off, but another sector is born, that's what's changed. And that's quite recent. That's about 30 years old. So just kind of putting capitalism in this big black box and saying, is it good, is it bad, are you for it, are you against it, misses this really granular, these massive changes that have occurred even just in the last 30 years. And we can shape those processes.
Okay, so we did the C question. I just want to do the G question. And I want to allow a little bit, enough time for people to talk, because we have to be out of here quite sharp, which seems a little bit of a shame, really. But this is a conversation that could go on a long time.
Oh, there's a cinema showing.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So very quickly, let's do the G question, because you do what you do argue, and in a sense what you're arguing there, Mariana, as well, is that if you get these things right, you can get back the productivity in the real economy that will allow you to expand the economy, to absorb the labour that's displaced by the labour productivity improvements that give you the growth in the first place. So
that, by the way, is cut off this chapter. Very much on that.
Yeah. Okay. So now, the difficulty with that, as I see it, is twofold. Firstly, that decline in labour productivity, labour productivity growth precedes the financial crisis by some time. So it's not a recent phenomenon in relation to the over-financialized markets going badly wrong. It's actually something that has its roots back in the mid-90s and 1960s and 70s, when productivity growth was at its highest, and it's been declining since that period in spite of those wonderful IT interventions that you're talking about. Now, it seems to me there's a couple of problems there when you're looking to that IT technology-based, labour productivity improvement-based route out, because in the first place, it's in danger of reducing the demand for labour, even if it doesn't eliminate it, which has less bargaining power for labour, which means the wage-profit gap might increase even more. And the second thing is, if you're putting that investment in labour productivity, and you're doing it through resource-intensive means of replacing labour, then you're pushing against your environmental boundaries. So isn't there a kind of systemic difficulty there in arguing for the expansion of growth through the existing mechanisms built around the technology route that we would all love to see make our lives better?
Yeah. So I don't know if I was unclear, and if I was, that's bad. I definitely don't see IT as either the solution or the problem. The real big change that has occurred is corporate governance, or one of the big changes. There's many different changes one should talk about, but the problem around inequality in terms of both the profit-wage relationship and the number of jobs, not just the type of jobs, is how companies are governed. So this massive shift, and this is 70s and early 80s, from even in the U.S., kind of a stakeholder model in terms of, if you look at the investments that were being made in General Electric and IBM and General Motors, these are not, I'm not talking about just IT, they were reinvesting those profits inside in things like training and human capital formation, right? So skills are not just through government training programs. People had jobs where they were valued. If you are fired today, and I just had someone up for dinner, well, I shouldn't go into details, but anyway, who has just lost his job and he's like 55, he will not find today a job. Like, these people are completely unvalued in today's way that we both run the labor market, but also how companies are run. So this massive, if you want, loss of experience, of skills, of knowledge that people have at that age, but even until 70, people have things to share. But when you set up an economy, and Bill Izanek calls this the new economy business model versus the old economy business model, which wasn't itself perfect. There was huge problems, and there was fights in making even that model better. But we've had this massive shift in terms of what's done with profits, how people are valued in companies, how businesses talk to governments, and the arm wrestling that is allowed to happen. Again, just look at what's happened to patents in the last 40 years. This is way before the financial crisis. Yep. But each one of those things were results of decisions. In this case, in companies. And Marx has this great thing about the spider. The story about the spider. He says, why is the best, spider web always going to be worse, less interesting than the worst house? In Italy, we call them geometry, the bad architects who ruin our coast. Why is the geometry better than the spider? Well, because he thought about things first, right? This consciousness, this strategic deliberation that humans have, that spiders don't have, in some ways is a really positive story. It means we could be thinking and doing things really differently. There's nothing deterministic in any of this. And lots of the secular stagnation stuff that people talk about, it makes it sound like it's deterministic. It's because of savings ratios. It's because we've already innovated as much as we could. No.
Okay. You pitched the argument, nonetheless. I mean, to come back to that sort of question, the central question of growth, you picked the argument nonetheless as saying, if you did these things differently, you made these decisions differently, if we had different corporate governments, if we had a different idea of the public sector, if we invested in different technologies, if we didn't over-financialize so much, then we could get growth back and save capitalism. But is that a fair paraphrase?
Yes, except that it sounds like saving capitalism was your objective all along, as it were. Whereas your objective is to have a society which produces prosperity of a better kind than we have now and more equally distributed. Yeah. And if capitalism has survived that process, then you may have incidentally saved it, right. But that's not the objective. Can I pick up the environmental question, which I think is crucial, and goes back to the book I wrote 26 years ago. And this sort of addresses the question of, is growth compatible with environmental integrity? And the answer is, we don't absolutely know, but we will not find out unless we try. Yeah. We absolutely know it is not compatible with environmentally unconstrained capitalism. If you do not constrain capitalism, or indeed any other kind of economic system, to within environmental limits, it will breach them. And that's the historical record, and it's absolutely the case. So the starting place for me has always been, you have to identify where those limits lie, and those limits are biophysically
they are biophysically based, but they are also socially determined. I mean, in the end, we have to choose how much biodiversity we want. There isn't a natural limit to biodiversity. We don't know. There are definitely places that you cannot go past, but we don't know exactly. And so much of biodiversity is culturally valued and not just sort of systemically required. So the biophysical basis, socially, politically chosen limits, and we need to constrain the economy to live within them. And by and large, that's what we're doing with carbon. And and we're not doing it fast enough. But the system that we're trying to get in place, that the Paris Agreement has, that the British government has under the Climate Change Act, is to say we will emit no more greenhouse gas emissions over this period than X, and we now have carbon budgets that run through to 2032, and the British economy will operate within those limits. And those limits are set by a biophysically informed but political choice process through an independent climate change committee ratified by government and so on. So it's pretty much the system that I'm trying to set out in my original book. And you can easily see why you can get growth within that, because those require different forms of energy system, demand and supply of energy, and there's no question that you can generate growth within those constraints because we know how to produce, generate value while still cutting emissions to those levels. Doing it to zero is much tougher. Doing it to zero while getting growth in the developing world, which needs much more income growth, tougher still. Doing it at the same time as we're also constraining nitrogen and biodiversity loss and so on, even tougher. Yeah. And contingently, empirically, we cannot say we can absolutely do that at this point because we don't know how to do it. But the question is, if you constrain at that level, then you will definitely want income growth if you can get it, and income and quality of life improvement within those systems. And that's what we're aiming for. But the constraints have to be there, and you can't hope that they will just be we will live within those constraints without imposing them on the system. What I would also argue, and the empirical evidence shows this, is you generate a lot of innovation by imposing constraints.
Right.
And so that is where a lot of the innovation has come from. It is through the imposition of constraints, which is why the market shaping, the involvement of the state drives innovation. And, Mariana has argued, you need the mission to decarbonise, and under that constraint, with the support of government and private sector, you will get a lot of innovation and so on. So there is definitely an empirical question of whether it's possible or not, but that's the direction and policy framework that you need.
Okay. I wanted just one last question before we go into the audience, which is around the politicisation of this debate, because it is a highly politicised debate in a sense. And I mean, Michael, you and I have had this conversation before, that actually to enter a politicised debate by waving red rag at its most sacred cow is that's not a mixed metaphor.
But what's the sacred cow?
Of growth, GDP growth.
Uh-huh.
So if you wade into an argument on that basis, it may well be that you reduce your political audience and therefore you reduce the ability to change. And your argument, Mariana, is also equally interesting in the politicised nature of it, because you've put forward an argument which says actually the public sector has a fundamental role to play in the processes of innovation that lead to social progress and will give you innovation.
But it has to be negotiated.
It has to be negotiated.
There's nothing automatic that the state will necessarily be good when it invests. I mean, that's because I think that's where you're totally right. Just because the state is powerful, it doesn't mean that then what follows is good.
No.
But by dismissing that and just thinking that the market is there, because I think it's almost equally simplistic. So what we're saying is, it's not just about fixing markets, it's about actively shaping and creating them. That's very different, but equally, growth itself, it's not about pro-growth or not pro-growth. It's about, again, what kind of growth and how this shaping and creating, which is constantly negotiating. And again, when I say fights, think of it as healthy fights, constructive fights, is part of that process. So
but is that an equal fight? I mean, I think that's, in a sense, that's the point. Of
course it's not an equal fight now, but it's like, so if you take a picture, a static picture, of course it's not an equal fight. There's huge imbalance. That's my whole point about patents currently are not being negotiated. Reinvestment, it's not being negotiated. The kind of share buybacks that we currently have used to be illegal. The law itself, if we believe in the law, it can change. It has changed to empower certain actors over others.
So here's my question, that it looks from the outside, when you look at that mix of things, the highly politicised nature of it, and the fact that it has led to these very, very unbalanced contracts between the private sector and the social good, it looks like the vision of the state that we have has somehow emasculated itself. And what is nice about your idea of the entrepreneurial state is to at least point to the role that the state has had in that process. But is it possibly also the case that in emasculating itself, it's distorted that role, and it's led to a kind of innovation that is not the sort of innovation we want to see if we wanted environmental targets in place, if we want good health systems, if we want social care in the
But the irony is,
community, and so on?
the irony is, I mean, if you think of it as, I think Jamie Galbraith talks about it as the predator state, or if you think of the captured state,
Yeah.
what I find, and I've been traveling much more than I'd like to be, in the last 4 years talking to governments worldwide and civil servants, is the most captured of all, and captured by different types of talk about, how you create value, how you create wealth. So the patent box, which is one of the worst regressive policies ever, was lobbied by GlaxoSmithKline. The most captured of all are those precisely that don't have a notion of the state as being able to actively shape, right? So David Cameron's government was massively captured, massively, by Google and GlaxoSmithKline. That doesn't mean that just having a great vision and a mission. I mean, Trump has a vision. He's got a big mission for the state. Wants to build those walls. None of this is about good or bad. It means it's the battleground. How you're defining the battleground. As soon as you pretend that the state can at best kind of facilitate things, you are defining that battleground in a particular way. And I would say that this capture and the outsourcing, just think of how much of the state has been outsourced. It's fine to outsource catering, and Sussex University students went on strike over catering. To be honest, I'm not bothered when a university outsources catering. But when you outsource the knowledge from government, when government stops to invest in its own capabilities, its own competencies, the state ends up getting captured. Why? Because the state becomes quite stupid. It doesn't even understand these things that are happening out there, and then it's always sort of one step behind. So there's this self-fulfilling prophecy. Who wants to become a civil servant today? Is it the same kind of people that used to want to become civil servants? So when you talk about the state as just fixing things, as opposed to, again, having an ambition that affects who wants to work in it. And Tony Judd's great book, Ill Fares the Land, talks about this discursive crisis about the state. And he says in the 1970s, at the same time that the state was really being attacked by the kind of Thatcher-Reagan things that happened after, you also had a change in vocabulary. You went from having ministries and departments to having administrations, right? So the state is just there to administer. I mean, how boring is that? That affects, again, who wants to go work in the state. So, again, it's a bit simplistic, but the state, of course, is completely captured today.
Okay. A question for, as we finish. I mean, Michael, you've worked in a very close capacity in relation to Treasury and government and the state. Mariana, you've put a huge kind of potentially in a challenge of innovation and renegotiating that contract. How would we get to that point where the state were effective? And before you answer that question, let's take some questions. Yep. Gentleman in the...
Well, everything you've been talking about is politics, really, to me, rather than economic problems. It's political choices. And listening to you, what's hindering the change? Is it a blind culture in terms of what economics is that now has infiltrated the state at every level? Is it this stupidity because we've lost all our good people? Or is it fear of flight of capital, which we're always told of? Fear of flight of capital, big international investors. Your state does this, they're no longer competitive, we'll take it everywhere else. Which of those three?
What are the three again?
Okay, let's take 2 or 3 questions.
Fear of international flight, which is always held over governments. International capital flight. Well, the other two you could conflate as a mixture of stupidity, blind adherence to an economic ideology of how things should be done.
Take another question here.
Thanks. Yeah, it's Donald Brown from Sprue. My question relates to the recently sent out the consultation industrial strategy. We were sat chewing through it. I was sat with Frank Giels, who made an interesting point. It said the government has the wrong theory of innovation as they formulated this strategy. And I wondered, first of all, do you agree with that? And secondly, how do we give them what is the right theory of innovation? How do we get this stuff into the political consciousness? Yeah.
Okay, and one more here.
Apologies, it's just the same question as the gentleman there. I didn't quite hear it. Is the UK big enough for the UK state to negotiate effectively with capital?
Now, after Brexit, or car crash?
Okay. So, is it a failure of economics? how do we get industrial strategy to work? Is the UK big enough to negotiate?
I'd actually, what's your name, sorry? I don't really understand your question because by definition economics is, political economy. So even if you're just looking at the actual variables, forget everything else, forget about the negotiation, the power relationships, to talk about profits, prices, investment, and the lack of it. There's all sorts of really interesting graphs we could have showed you. That's the sort of economic indicators, then different theories of what drives business investment. And by the way, our theory is that what drives business investment, sort of the Keynesian theory, are the gut instincts of where the future opportunities are. So one of the roles of the state should be actually to be financing these opportunities as opposed to just, again, coming up with a tax credit which assumes business wants to invest and you've actually just increased their profits. And again, profits are at record levels.
They don't want to listen to your point of view. I've talked to enough people around the Treasury who...
Yeah, but the Treasury is equally politicized. I mean, that's what I was trying to say, that, it's not that economics is out there as this, great science, rigorous science, doing all this great sort of math and models, and then there's these people talking about the politics. If you look at what math is used, and this is why I have little patience for people who say there's too much math. There's not too much math in economics. It's the wrong math. They chose the math from Newtonian physics, which is all about, the representative agent, a unique equilibria, et cetera. So it's a very unscientific method. We want to prove that. Which math should we use? This. So lots of the evolutionary Schumpeterian economics has been going to now increasingly biology. So even just something as easy as distance from mean dynamics, so replicator dynamics, it's a very different type of equation, which is that you grow depending on how different you are from me. I mean, this doesn't sound very political, but it means that if we're all the same, you can even talk about growth. Whereas the notion of the representative agent is giving attention to the average, whereas in this other type of economics, evolutionary Schumpeterian, you couldn't even talk about change if you were talking about averages. So just to say there's different tools that we could be using, and unfortunately economics has been so ideological that even which equations we use. And so lots of the Rethinking Economics movement, which I think is a great movement, I think it's been quite weakened by this notion that we should just make economics more user-friendly. Take away some math, bring in the stories. I'm like, but the stories are equally ideological. And perhaps we should take away some of the math, but that's not the problem.
Michael,
that leads into the question about the industrial strategy. So let's be generous to start with, which is that it's good that a government now wants to do industrial strategy, and a Conservative government in particular, since Conservatives in general have wanted to have less government involvement and have generally thought that markets and private enterprises should be left to their own devices, by which they actually mean should have a certain degree of regulation but not other interventions. So it's a good thing that they're thinking that way. The failure is that the Green Paper, the consultation document, has no theory of innovation, has no theory of anything. And that's basically because the civil servants were charged by ministers who themselves didn't know what to do, wanted to do something, didn't know what it was, to come up with something, and in a short period, civil servants trained not to think about industrial strategy have not been able to do so. So that Green Paper is a set of subject headings, which they've called 10 pillars, which are definitely the right subject headings because it's more or less everything, with no very little new ideas, and as civil servants will always do, gathering together all the things they've done in the past and putting them under new labels and then calling. And they kind of know, as everybody has pointed out to them, that this isn't a strategy and there is no theory behind it. So in a sense, they've got... I don't think there is a theory behind it. What they're now trying to do is to get more people to help them with it. On innovation in particular, I'm interested in Mariana's view of this. The Innovate UK, which is the new body that was set up out of the Technology Strategy Board, which originally was a kind of arm's length civil servant thing, but is now an independent organisation. There's some interesting stuff in there, and it's beginning to develop a culture of independence and thought. Now, this is very early stages, but it'll be very interesting to see once they really start thinking about innovation, whether modern innovation theory, and of which Frank Gales is an interesting exponent, and Mariana's done a lot of work, begins to inform the way they work. But right now, industrial strategy is not a strategy. What I would say, though, is that the fact that they've got it, the fact they've got a department with that in the title, indicates a willingness to think about how investment occurs in the economy, how productivity is generated, and the role of policy in helping to do that. And by and large, British civil servants, the British governments regarded private sector investment as something to leave alone, and this is an acknowledgement that it's the private sector needs help to invest properly, both rate and directionality, and in that sense, it's a good thing. But
But one of the
barely at
biggest
starting
problems, I
gate.
think, with the current one, and just really quickly, is
Yeah.
that it's still sectoral based. And because so many sectors in the UK are inertial, you shouldn't just be feeding them money or support. You should be transforming them. Hence the example of steel. And this is why, by the way, it's not just about high tech. It's low tech. The whole economy could be transformed
Yeah.
through this kind of
Okay,
mission-oriented.
I was hoping you might say something about that at some point. Unfortunately,
Yeah,
we have absolutely run up against our time limit, and in a place where we could obviously go on talking in a really interesting way for a long time. So maybe you can invite us back at some point.
Can we just
Nick.
answer this question
It is
very,
the
very
question
quickly?
that's hanging, and it is the question that I wanted you to ask, really, about how that contract, particularly with the power asymmetries that exist, could they be negotiated?
So my very quick answer is the reason, particularly for people on the left of centre and on people who want a social intervention, who want to shape society, the reason for the existence of the EU is to establish a stronger negotiating platform for both for basic rights, for labour rights, for environmental rights and so on, but also for shaping. And the European Investment Bank is a really interesting institution whose scale is different and so on. So can the British state do it on its own? It's much, much weaker. It's much smaller. It's much less. It's got much less power. So it's a really good way of phrasing the question of the challenge of Brexit, and it's a challenge which most of us thinking about this think, are deeply regretful of this. There's no question. That was the point of the EU.
Can I just say quickly, I agree with that, but having said that, there's some tiny little cute countries like Denmark doing huge things. So Denmark is today the #1 provider of high-tech services to China's green economy. And they also do the manufacturing, of course. But how much is China spending on green? 1.7 trillion. And that one little country, because when it does things, it's not in this patchy way, like our industrial policy is very patchy. It kind of thinks big around, or, the German kind of energy event policy. That stuff is transformational. So as much as I agree, Brexit is a car crash. There's no way, it really won't work. But, whatever.
That seems almost like the perfect segue to tee you up for tomorrow, next CUSP event. Actually, we have a Danish policymaker coming to talk in particular about the way that the Alternativet Party in Denmark has led that agenda for change. That's at the Sustainability in Turbulent Times conference.
Where is this?
It's in County Hall. Yeah, thank you very much. And Michael and Mariana will be outside a little bit longer, both to sign books and
to drink.
And to answer questions that
Right.
you may still have. Thank you all very much.
We're going to go to the New Cross House, which is just down the road.
Thank you both of you.
Thank you.